I'm really happy to welcome you all to the Brattleboro Literary Festival's Literary Cocktail Hour, where we will be discussing the selected letters of John Updike. We do these online events about once a month throughout the year, in addition to our in-person literary festival that will take place in Brattleboro, Vermont, this fall from October 16th to 18th. And hopefully when we have that event, the foliage is like that, which it often is, the foliage behind me. I wholly recommend this book, wholeheartedly recommend this book. I read it and listened to it for over a period of a few months, and I absolutely loved immersing myself in the voice of John Updike and in the literary scene of his day. So when I was able to connect with James Schiff, the editor of this book, I was very excited to plan this event and was even more thrilled when he suggested that Michael Updike, John's son, would join the conversation. So thank you to both of them and to everyone else who is here watching. And now I'll just do a brief introduction of each of them. James Schiff is the author or editor of 6 books on contemporary American fiction, including Selected Letters of John Updike, which was in Knopf 2025, which was named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, was listed as one of the New Yorker's best books of the year, and also one of the Wall Street Journal's best books of the fall, and many other accolades. Lisa Halliday wrote in the Telegraph about the book that it was, quote, magnificent, a profoundly poignant portrait, an invaluable historical document, and a timely reflection on the eternal tensions between societal conventions and free speech. The selection has been deftly edited by James Schiff. Done this well, epistolary biographies comes to seem the best and most honorable kind. Schiff received his BA from Duke University, his MA and PhD from NYU, and is a professor of English at the University of Cincinnati. He is currently working on a biography of John Updike, which I know I'll be very excited to read. Michael Updike spent his childhood in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and has lived in Newburyport and Newbury since 1992. He is an artist, designer, and sculptor, and for more than 3 decades, he has designed for Mariposa, where he is best known for his String of Pearls collection. For the past 15 years, he has worked with stone. He exhibits his carved slate tiles in galleries and art festivals around New England, and he carves personalized gravestones for clients, and annually he carves his own gravestone and other humorous, irreverent stones. Make sure to look at his website. We're going to post it. You'll enjoy them, including a gravestone for Gumby and Pollyanna, who's doing fine, which will make you smile. He graduated from the Massachusetts College of Art and later received his MFA from Vermont College. Michael has also given presentations at John Updike and Philip Roth Society conferences, and this winter he's been presenting readings of the Selected Letters of John Updike, and he is currently serving on the John Updike Literary Trust. So now I'm going to turn this over to Jim and Michael. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Do we start talking?
Yep, just start. Yep, I'm going to disappear.
Hi, I'm Michael Updike, and I want to thank you all for coming today. I hope we make this hour worth your while. My assistant is my wife, Olga, and you'll meet her a little later. And I'll turn you over to the man of the hour, Mr. Jim Schiff.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Jenny, for the introduction. That was great. It's nice to be with you all today, virtually in Brattleboro. I was asked in 2015 by Martha Updike, John's second wife, to consider editing the letters of her husband, and John had died in 2009. And I was flattered, but at the same time, I was a little overwhelmed, largely because John did not save copies of the letters he wrote and just kind of sent them out into the world. So I really didn't know where they all were. And then the second point of hesitation, perhaps, was that John Updike was a mass producer. I mean, he not only produced 65 volumes of literature, most of it published by Knopf, but he wrote thousands, if not tens of thousands, of letters, notes, and postcards. So I would have to find them all. So that was a real challenge. And I guess you might even say, why would anybody want to do this? But I think for me, part of the reason was that John Updike's letters are terrific. And for those of you who had a chance to read them, I hope you'll agree. I mean, they're funny, they're witty, they're intelligent, they're verbally precise, they're observant. And his intent was always to provide pleasure. And I say that both for himself as the writer, but for the reader. In addition, the letters tell you things that you don't know about people. And I think we all turn to fiction for that, but I think we turn to letters for that as well. And as John Updike's editor at the New Yorker, William Maxwell, said, all of us, had we known our mail would be investigated, would have written less freely as we worked away. So I think those reasons in particular drew me to this project. And I think, you might even have the question of why Updike, because I've been working on John Updike for 40 years now, since I was a graduate student. And some might question, why still are you working 40 years later on John Updike? And it's in part because he wrote quite a bit, but also, and I think for me and for many people, the primary reason is nobody writes sentences like John Updike. They are so elegant and intelligent and alert and watchful and clever. So that is certainly the primary reason. The other part is I'm speaking to you from Cincinnati, where I spend part of the year, and I grew up in Cincinnati. And though I do love it here, and there's, and maybe Cincinnati is better than it's ever been in my entire lifetime, it was not a place that I wanted to be as a as a college student and as a graduate student. I wanted to be in Tolstoy's Russia or Hemingway's Paris. And my own part of the world, Middle America, did not seem that interesting to me. So I think through reading John Updike, I really saw how interesting and mysterious and brilliant and beautiful the American quotidian was and is and continues to be. So that was really what drew me to his work. In terms of the letters themselves, there was a great range of letters. John wrote about 2,000 letters or postcards to his mother, Linda, who was also an aspiring writer, whom he watched as a child, sending her stories off to the New Yorker and other magazines to be published. So that's kind of the foundation of his letter writing. But there are many wonderful letters that were written to Michael's mother, Mary, who John met at a medieval art class when she was a senior at Radcliffe and he was a sophomore at Harvard. There are also many good letters to his second wife, Martha, who's Michael's stepmother. There are letters to editors, family members, critics, readers, fans. He even wrote letters to me. I had about 20 or 25 letters and postcards that John sent me. And I was always surprised by his speed, too, at responding. When you write John Updike a letter, assuming he's in town at that time, you would often have a response back from him in about 4 or 5 days. So it was my duty to collect all of these letters, find them. They were literally all over the world. They're in, institutional libraries like Harvard and Yale and Princeton and the New York Public Library. But, in they're the National Library in Scotland and East Carolina State University and all sorts of institutional libraries. And I think there's a lot of them that are still in people's drawers and attics, and maybe they don't even know they have them. But the book contains about 700 letters, which is about 3 to 5% of the letters that I read, or that I included in the volume. So getting your letter into the volume, I guess, is not so unlike getting your child into an Ivy League school. There was a lot of competition, and there was about 96 or 7% of the letters that I read that didn't make it, and many of them are very, very good. It was just an abundance of riches. So that's a little bit of a background to the book. I also should add, I think many of the best letters were written to women, particularly to his mother and to his 2 wives. But there's also great letters to other writers like Norman Mailer and Ian McEwan and Joyce Carol Oates and Philip Roth and so many different writers. But I think our plan for the next, 40 minutes or so, Michael, is we're gonna have a little bit of a conversation, but then Michael and I are gonna kind of punctuate that by our reading of letters and excerpts from letters. And
Yes, Jim, sorry to interrupt, but if I
yeah,
may, before we get to the content, I had the pleasure to introduce Jim Schiff on the opening night of this book at the Salmagundi Club. So I'm just going to go through a few of the things that Jim is kind of too modest to point out. And we had just gotten, or the book and Jim had just gotten a very good review by Dwight Gardner of the New York Times that morning of the talk. So I start off talking, and you have to follow me. In the movie Misery, starring James Caan, who plays an author and suffers physical and psychological torture and writes a book about the experience. And after he's done all of that, Lauren Bacall plays his agent and tells him that he's received good reviews with a love letter from the New York Times. And that's what Jim had received that day in October. I met Jim at an Updike appreciation at the Reading Public Library. And I could see what a good teacher he was as he went line by line through a passage of my father's short story, A&P. And what sticks in my mind was a professorial way, without a hint of a smirk or ironic glint, he brought up the line, the two smoothest scoops of vanilla. And then we met again through various John Updike conferences, etc. And he's right, my stepmother secretly interviewed Jim by taking him to the expensive club that she belonged to and not really telling Jim until like the second or third meeting what she had in mind for him. And Jim did weigh the obligations that he had as a teacher and an editor and a vice president of the Updike Society, and decided he would take on this assignment. And his first challenge was to convince my stepmother, Martha, that the personal letters needed to be included. She kind of perceived this as a professorial correspondence between writers and other high-minded editors, etc. And the ironic thing is, once Jim did convince her of this, Martha gave some of the most vivid personal letters, and I did learn a lot about my father through them. So we had a target date of 2020. That was like 5 years to do it. COVID hit and things got delayed. And Jim sort of downplays the effort he put into looking for letters in archives. I mean, you've got to go to the University of Texas to find Norman Mailer's letters, and he had a lot of Updike letters there, and you've got to check this archive and that. And archives are not places where you punch in the computer and find it. You find a box of stuff they've thrown in there in an archival box. So, and you have to go through it and see what you find. And to use my father's term, you're looking for a jewel amid offal. But and the other thing, the personal letters. He went around collecting names, asking people if they had Updike letters. And he said it was like asking people if they had their 12-year-old tax returns there. And most people say, okay. And I'm really disappointed one letter didn't get in it, because this woman was nudging my father to be in the Newburyport Literary Festival for years. And finally, out of exasperation, he wrote to her, "Dear Vicky, no, 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 no. Regards, John." And the collected, Jim mentioned the letters to his mother and his two wives, my mother Mary and mother Martha. And I think those three women are really responsible for the backbone of this letters collection. My grandmother saved every letter he wrote, including one when he was 9 years old to his father having a hernia operation, and to the ones that he wrote to her right before her demise. My mother had all of her college romance letters and some pretty graphic divorce letters, which are pretty harsh. And then once they're divorced, they get sweeter and nicer at the end. And there's one where he's writing her on what would have been their 50th anniversary, and says, "Thanks for being a beautiful bride," and all the rest. And then Martha, who had the insight to select Jim Schiff for this job. She knew early on that Jim was the man who could do it. And she convinced Chris Cardouf, who was an editor associated with the Literary Trust, and they set off on doing it. And Martha's letters are a great addition to the volume. And she also, towards the last 7 or 8 years of my father's life, convinced him to write his letters on the computer so that she could print out a copy. I mean, he never had email or anything, but he did have a word processor, which he would. And she saw a lot of those letters get into Harvard, into the archives, et cetera. So the other thing that Jim did, which he downplayed, was the notes that really moved this entire collection along. And to do that, you really need to know what reviewers are saying about Updike, but what they're saying about Roth and Mailer and all the other contemporary authors, how these authors are corresponding, what the reaction is to it. So you really need the pantheon to be aware of that. And there's no real bit of information that Jim wouldn't hunt down. I remember one of the questions, I mean, a lot of them we couldn't answer, but he hunted down a letter that said, I saw in the Alice's. And he's like, what is the Alice's? And we were like, well, Jim, that's that little store down by the wharf in Ipswich. And so, during the making of this, we had 2 demises. We had my stepmother, Martha, passed away, and Chris Cardew suddenly passed away, all within a 2-month period, which was kind of a shock. But we continued, and Jim took over the full editing along with Deb Garrison. And then one funny part to this, when we thought the letters volume was complete and just waiting, one of my father's lovers, Joan Cuddy, called last minute after she told Jim she didn't have any letters. Suddenly she did have letters and wanted them in the book. And Jim halted a little bit of the production so that could get in there. And the last thing I'll say is this book really reads as sort of a biography, as a chronicling of a person's life. And it really, kind of is a page turner. You just keep going and going. And I'm going to try and pronounce this word correctly. I liken Jim to bringing in a beautiful galleon chock full of epistolary treasures. So thank you, Jim. Wonderful.
Thank you, Michael. That was you brought back lots of good memories and of those years of putting the book together. But really, I mean, you and your siblings, Miranda, Elizabeth, David, have all been terrifically supportive throughout the process and made it enjoyable and interesting, and we're so supportive. So no, it was even though it did take a lot of years, and maybe I have some selective memory on it. It was really a project that was mostly pleasant, and as I said, because I think of the nature of your father's letters. But I think what we're going to try and do going forward is have a little bit of a conversation, but then Michael and I have some letters that we're going to read from, probably mostly of excerpts from those letters. But I thought maybe we'd just start really by going back to when I first gave you the manuscript, Michael, which I think was the earliest draft was about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was pretty close to what we ended up with. But I mean, there were changes, and then there were some cuts and so on. But I was curious, when you read the letters really for the first time, Michael, what what things did you learn about your father that you didn't know before? Were there surprises, or was it mostly confirmation of things you knew?
Most parents give their children a mythology of their childhood, etc. And so we knew my father was applying to the New Yorker for a long time. We knew he was a cartoonist for the Harvard Lampoon, but he sort of downplayed how remarkable his early success was. I mean, to be accepted by the New Yorker your first summer out of college was kind of amazing. And I mean, I think the closest as children we got to his work was actually a board game he made of, it's considered kind of inappropriate now because it's an African jungle scene, sort of like a Tarzan movie, and you roll dice and move around on it. And we all, as 3, 4, 5-year-olds, would sit around and play that a lot. And so, And so he talked about, his days at Shillington and rather disdainfully about what I think made him the writer he is, moving him to rural Pennsylvania to a farm where his grandmother had gone. But I want to show you something. This hung in our house all the time, and my wife Olga will show it to you. And you see that? And I'm going to read it to you. It says, to John Updike, with best wishes, Steinberg, 1945. And so the question I ask you is, if you do the math, my father was 13 years old then. And 45 was the concluding year of World War II. So how does a Pennsylvania farm boy obtain an original drawing like that? And I think, Jim, you had a letter that would help us.
Yeah, I think I might have an answer to that, Michael.
Okay.
And I'll add to your introduction to it. It is, that John was living with his parents and his grandparents in a tiny remote sandstone farmhouse in Plowville, which was 50 miles from Philadelphia, but it may have been, it could have been 1,000 miles away from the rest of the world. It was very isolated at the time. And his family, as a lot of Depression era families, did not have a great deal of money. And their connection with the outside world really was through radio and through newspapers and books and movies. And I think in John Updike's case, the U.S. mail, the U.S. Postal Service was crucial. So, he began sending out stories and cartoons and poems and so on when he was 13 or 14, began sending to the New Yorker around that time and just after. And he also wrote to cartoonists. And I actually want to read, John Updike, though he became a famous writer, really wanted to be a cartoonist for the New Yorker, wanted to be a Disney animator. And this is a letter that he wrote. It's an excerpt from a letter that he wrote when he was 15 years old to the cartoonist and creator of Little Orphan Annie, a man named Harold Gray. So this was dated January 2, 1948. Dear Mr. Gray, I don't suppose that I am being original when I admit that Orphan Annie is and has been for a long time my favorite comic strip. There are many millions like me. I admire the plotting of Annie's adventures. They are just as adventure strips should be. Fast-moving, slightly macabre, occasionally humorous, and above all, they show a great deal of the viciousness of human nature. I am very fond of the gossip in the streets scenes you frequently use. Contrary to comic strip tradition, the people are not pleasantly benign, but gossiping, sadistic, and stupid, which is just as it really is. I like the methods in which you polish off your evildoers. One of my happiest moments was spent in gloating over some hideous child who had been annoying Annie and then toppled into the wet cement of a dam being constructed. I hate your villains to the point where I could rip them from the paper. No other strip arouses me so. Your draftsmanship is beyond reproach, which is typically the way 15-year-olds talk. No, I mean it's really extraordinary. His verbal abilities and facilities at that age. The drawing is simple and clear, but extremely effective. You could tell just by looking at the faces who is the troublemaker and who isn't, without any dialogue. The facial features, the big blunt-fingered hands, the way you handle light and shadows are all excellently done. Even the talk balloons are good. The lettering small and clean, the margins wide, and the connection between the speaker and his remark wiggles a little, all of which to my eye is as artistic as you can get. And you do see the interest in the verbal precision, the way he did see the way as somebody who draws sees. All this well-deserved praise is leading up to something, of course, and the catch is a rather big favor I want you to do for me. I need a picture to alleviate the blankness of one of my bedroom walls, and there's nothing that I would like better than a little memento of the comic strip I have followed closely for over a decade. So could you possibly send me a little autographed sketch of Annie that you have done yourself? Whatever I get will be appreciated, framed, and hung. Um, really one, and there are other letters that he's written to cartoonists, but you certainly see the letter, the kind of letter that would have been written to Saul Steinberg, and that's dated. When is that dated, Michael and Olga? That's
1945.
1945. So he would have been a little bit younger then. The one I just read was from 1948.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
so Michael, just kind of move. We're going to try and move chronologically through John Updike's life. But your father went to Harvard on a scholarship and then received a fellowship to the Ruskin School of Drawing in Oxford, England, where he and your mother took classes in drawing and painting. And it was also there where he really, he was launched the summer before as a New Yorker writer. Um, and was beginning to interact with folks at the New Yorker and submitting more material. But I believe there's a letter from that period when he was in Oxford that you'd like to talk about and read, Michael.
Yes, and actually, there's two letters. I'm going to squish them into one, and it's to Catherine White, and she was his fiction and poetry editor at the New Yorker. She is the wife of Stuart Little fame E.B. White, just so you know that. So it goes, and this is written just before he's going to England. Dear Mrs. White, thank you so much for your kind words about his first story, Friends from Philadelphia. The odd thing is that those two first-person stories that nobody liked were composed after Friends. A holdup due to Mr. Hoffaletter's vacation made the order seem reversed. I once saw a movie in which a chimpanzee, let loose in a laboratory, proceeded to mix, by accident, with his elbows, some sort of highly potent elixir. I know now how he felt when he wanted him to stir up a second batch. The bonus for quality plan, though, sets a properly optimistic tone, and I am grateful to you for sending it to me. I go to England the day after tomorrow, but now is the time to tell you the patient and abundant attention you have paid my offerings this summer is one of the nicest things that has happened to me in my brief and lucky life. And now we're going to fast forward just 28 days. He's been in England and he's still corresponding with Mrs. White. And the tone of this one seems a little changed. And there's two things I want you to look at. He mentions Pygmalion Bernard Shaw, who was a playwright who used semicolons and full colons when an apostrophe would suffice. And here is a Fowler's Book of Language, Dictionary, and Punctuation Rules. So, dear Mrs. White, I'm sorry I haven't gotten this proof back to you sooner. It came to me less than an hour ago. It was stamped with 6 cents, obviously under the impression it was bound for somewhere in the States. Yes, I do own a copy of Fowler, but along with my parents' pet cat, rubber basketball, and other steadying influences, I left it in America. Colons tend to be a weakness with me ever since I took a course in the works of George Bernard Shaw. They look so pert and snappy. Somehow I always think of a semicolon as dragging one foot. I fear in poetry I use punctuation improperly to indicate the degree of stop I want. Thank you for correcting me. My selling you something very timely from England is a pleasing notion, and of course, if it should happen, you have my permission to do minor editing without consulting me. I hope our concepts of minor editing correspond. I should think that in a poem, the change of any word would be major. In prose, I'll trust you to draw the line between merely syntactical and fundamental alteration. Airmail from New York City to me takes 2 or 3 days, only slightly longer than the average time between New York City and Pennsylvania. I appreciate that in any case, The New Yorker is extraordinarily considerate of its authors, and I, for one, am grateful. So he's giving her a little bit of a pushback, but in a friendly, nice way, just setting the boundaries to her. And they did have a nice relationship over the years. Mm-hmm.
And I love those two excerpts, Michael, and I think they do show the fun and the playfulness and the wonderful sense of humor that your father had at the same time, where he was trying to make a point and always doing it so diplomatically and in such clever fashion. It also occurred to me as you were talking about that is it might be useful. I might just take 30 seconds and kind of run us through your father's progression, because he did marry, your parents married early. Your father married after his junior year of college, so he was 21, and he had been submitting to the New Yorker for years. And by the time he actually had something accepted, which was just after graduation, so about a year after his marriage, the summer of 1954, he had a poem accepted and then a short story. And this was after several hundred rejections from the New Yorker, but then began, a rapid string of acceptances from them. And during that year in England, he matured to the point where they were, John Updike pieces were appearing in the New Yorker every few weeks. And and then he came back and then took a job at the New Yorker. But if we move a few years later, after he's been kind of successful as a short story writer and as a poet, particularly a poet of light verse, in the late 1959, he began writing Rabbit Run, and that was published in 1960. And it was with that novel, really, that your father began writing more openly about sexuality. And and it's interesting, in fact, as he wrote to to your grandmother in 1959, he was discussing this new novel that he was writing called Rabbit Run. And he said to your grandmother, he said, remembering Mrs. Updike's exclamation, Mrs. Updike being his mother, remembering Mrs. Updike's exclamation upon reading the first 50 pages of The Poorhouse Fare, which was John Updike's first novel, and his mother had said that I tried, that John had tried to write a novel without any sex in it. I have not made the same attempt twice. So there was clearly sex in the novel. And so what I'm interested in here is what was the reaction really? And I know you were in 1960, you were only a year old, so you don't necessarily have conscious memory of that. But I'm curious, just even later, or things that you heard about your family's reaction to your father's writing, and particularly to the sexuality, even the level of obscenity which he was accused of from time to time in his work. And also when you were growing up in Ipswich in the 60s and 70s, what you would hear, particularly after couples. So I am curious about what kind of was in the air, and how the family was reacting to the sexuality.
Um, yeah, see, I was not really aware of my parents' extracurricular activity until I think my older sister informed me of all the dalliances between my friends' parents and who was doing what with who. Um, but my mother sort of was defending my father's writing to me, and she just said, well, your father's philosophy is to write about everything under the sun. And to him, sex is part of it. And so he feels like he has a license to do that. And it's natural to write about it. And so that's the sort of thing I took with it. And then when you asked about surprises in this letter, the surprise was the negative feedback he got when he lent a copy of Rabbit Run pre-publication to his friend and minister, Goldie Sherrill, who wrote him a scolding letter saying, you don't want to do this book, you don't do it. And my father wrote a brilliant defense from Anguilla. And unfortunately, we don't have time to read that one. But after it was published, my grandmother, his mother-in-law, wrote him a letter sort of admonishing him for having written such a scandalous book. And rather than me try and defend it, I think he does it himself very well. So, and it's very germane to what's going on now with banning books, et cetera, and decency laws, et cetera. So her name is Mrs. Pennington, and she's married to a minister, my grandfather, Leslie Pennington. Dear Mrs. P, thanks for your letter, as warm and sprightly as always. I guess you just don't like my ex-basketball players, and should be relieved to know, therefore, that having them pass through a poem, a short story, and a novel, as far as I know, I am through with them. Your reaction to Rabbit, while somewhat severe, is not inappropriate. I don't think he's especially stupid, but otherwise your adjectives seem fair, and in calling him a grown-up child, you have unwittingly, I'm sure, described us all. I don't attempt as a writer to control the reader's reactions to my people. All I try to do is present them as truly as I can. I'm glad you liked Lucy and Ralph. Myself, I liked them all, especially Kruppenbach, the Lutheran minister. As to your worry about Liz, my eldest sister, I must confess that that is one aspect of my problems that I hadn't occurred to me. In general, I think looking back on my own childhood, that we should be allowed to read whatever we care to read. No doubt we get some nasty starts doing it, but better to get them than avoid them. Of course, I can't picture Liz at 13 the way you can, having raised two daughters. I can't even picture her reading my books. Marquand somewhere complained that his children never read any of his books. I don't think that the book, if it is disturbing, would disturb her any more whether I or someone else wrote it. After all, it's not as if I ever had made the high school basketball team or lived in Mount Judge. Anyway, I guess being a writer's daughter has some disadvantages, although being a writer's daughter is probably easier than being a writer's mother-in-law. Even being a writer has its advantages. Trying to tell the truth is not really a welcome service, but I haven't figured out any other way to go about my business. You wonder why I had to write the book. I had to write it because writing is my vocation, and I chose to write this particular story because it contained in images that were alive for me, a problem or conflict that seems real and important. I don't think that the moral of the book is very unexceptional. The moral being that pure self seeking, pure following the inner light does cause eruptions in the social web and therefore pain. As to the sex, sex is important to Harry as it is to many other young men of his age, and therefore it is important in the book. I don't see why sexual encounters should not be described as fully as any other sort of encounter between people. They contain just as much nuance. I'm sorry that through the accident of marriage, you've been thrown into close familial conjunction with a writer you don't really like. Honestly, I don't ask you to read me. I send you the books as a token of my esteem and affection. You needn't open them. Love, Johnny Jump Up. And that's his nickname that she gave him, meaning the flower. So, um, yeah. And speaking of what was his wording? Some jumps and starts while reading it. I didn't answer your question about the shock from reading this letters book, and it's to my stepmother, Martha. Dearest Chick, your half slip is silkily hid in your metal box, along with a lovely roll of contacts. The unlovely, I should say, poor Michael's lacrosse game was done dim justice. So somewhere there's fewer pictures of my lacrosse game because he's filming his future second wife nude.
That's funny. That was a nice surprise there, Michael. I wasn't anticipating that one. The uh with the first letter to his mother-in-law, I think it's such a brilliant. I mean, it could be the model letter for writers who have to deal with somebody in their family who is objecting to something they've written, or particularly if it deals with sexuality. And I just think he handles that so magnificently, in a really honest way, but also kind of funny and clever, but kind of holding his ground as well. And I think one of the lessons for me in reading those letters that came out in 1959 and 1960, I mean, he had, as you mentioned, Goldie Sherrill kind of urging him not to publish this book, and then he's got his mother-in-law, who is clearly not happy with it. He's got the lawyers at Alfred A. Knopf Publishing House, very concerned about there being upcoming litigation because of the book, and that, changes need to be made. And I think what's so fascinating to me about that is there was all this pressure about not publishing this book, or how could you create this character? And he held on to his beliefs, and he went on to create the character who became then his most famous character, who became a kind of a kind of a mythical character in 20th century American literature in the way that Holden Caulfield was, or even in the 19th century, how Huck Finn was, but there was a lot of pressure against him in doing that. Um, I just thought it was wonderful. I think those letters really illustrate what he was having to deal with, but how the kind of confidence he had in his vision. Um, I am curious about, actually, it hadn't occurred to me now till now, Michael, but how, and I do think of your father as being very confident in his writing. Did you see him as a confident man in terms of the things you would see him do?
I wouldn't, that wouldn't be my first adjective. I
Right,
mean,
right.
he was confident in his writing, which he kind of kept private. And I didn't really, people assume we talked like Gertrude Stein's, salon at dinner, but it was really quite the opposite of that. It was typical family members. And you could get little snippets out of him. I mean, like you mentioned Solinger. He said that Solinger left the New Yorker and went into reclusion after the New Yorker rejected his short story Teddy, which Solinger put as the last story in his 9 stories, and that was sort of New Yorker gossip we got, and other little snippets like that. And of course, like in high school, I asked him to help me with my paper, and I'm just trying to write. It's just oozing out of him all this stuff, and I'm like, wait, talk slower. I need to write it down, and stuff. So, but no, he was. It was just very polite in person and funny and joking and nice, is sort of the feeling I got. I mean, I wasn't happy about the divorce or sort of the separation or access to him in our later years that my stepmother prevented. But he was always jolly and sort of trying his best. But I think his writing that's his world and his domain, and he's going to do what he wants in it.
Mhm.
And even some of the later novels, with people have scratching their heads, like towards the end of the time, I can read them and see that it's not quite clicking as a complete and whole novel, but there's such wonderful parts of it that you have to sort of digest it that way and take the beautiful parts.
Yeah. Well, and when you were just talking about him being kind of funny and polite and so on, I'm curious about, because your father's now been gone for 17 years, and I'm kind of curious what are the things that you most remember, either scenes or moments or gestures, um, um, just whether at the dinner table or at events or when you would see him, at the parties in Ipswich or later on in Beverly Farms, even what are the kind of things that stick with you?
I mean, there was always a joke. I did an intro for a literary festival and talked about the dinner question, and he would always make these faces as he cut the chicken my mother had made undercooked. And he'd say, you know what the Vikings do? They'd stick a knife in their thigh to see who could get it in the furthest. And just sort of funny off the wall things like that. We were looking for our mother's wallet one day, and I found it under the car seat. And he looked at it and said, "Well, here's what we should do with Mom's wallet." And he threw it out the window, and sort of, I think, just for my amusement and stuff. So there was a lot of his humorous father in there, and but there was also an insight and care. And like when I cracked up the Volvo at age 16 and a half, he did not go into the classic berate, outrage father. I sheepishly showed him the crumpled metal, and he gave me a hug. And that's the kind of compassion that he had. So I don't know if he needed the hug more than I did, um, but yeah, no, he was. And reading through the letters, I realized, I was like, oh God, another letter from him, postcard. How encouraging and hopeful they are, and complimentary. I mean, to me, I had some years where I'm not so proud of my formal initial attempts at an education, and but he's always there, and he always kind of had my back.
No, that's actually and I think particularly well the encouraging nature, but and the humor and the joking I think is wonderful, and you do see that in the letters as well. And I'm curious in terms of after having taught Rabbit at Rest and Rabbit is Rich in the last few years, I do know there's also a lot of there's a lot of passages dealing with death, and this goes back to even some of those stories in Pigeon Feathers. And death does seem very important in his literature or in his writing, and I'm curious, did you ever see that manifestation of that at all? Because he was, I get the sense that he was kind of a jokester and very funny and supportive, but did you see the darker side of him at all or was that kind of just for his writing?
That was kept for his writing, and I think he burdened it on his wife's. My mother, she was kind of our father Updike, translator at times or a spokesperson, and she just said, he really fears death, and he can't believe that we're here and then we're not going to be here, and that's kind of, and I think that's why he held on to religion. He, he just said, I just cannot let that part go. And so, but yeah.
Well, I was going to turn to a letter that has something to do with you, and if I can here, and this is so we're kind of moving up. We're in 1981, and you had just returned from a summer abroad in the Soviet Union and Europe, and as I understand, while you were abroad, you had been a sort of a hero in saving some lives, but also had fallen in love with a Russian in-tourist guide, though nothing came of it. But I'm just going to read a brief excerpt from that letter, the opening paragraph. So this is September 28th, 1981, John Updike to Michael. Dear Michael, what a delightful way to begin the week, talking to you. We're all so glad you got back safely and are giving Lawrence another go. Checks enclosed. Your mother, who called just after you and I hung up, told me that you saved a Russian lady with a Heimlich maneuver. Amazing. And that you also saved a fellow American from drowning. You seem to have been very busy doing good, and you sounded very calm and at ease in Appleton. I'm just as glad you didn't marry the Russian girl. Look what happened to Lee Harvey Oswald.
So,
And I hope we can widen the screen to Olga, who has been assisting Michael. Maybe you can tell the rest.
I did marry a Russian girl, but it took 35 years to find the right one. She's right here.
I was a little bit too young in 1981.
So we didn't touch on reading my father's sex letters, or also something I'm loath to do. It's very creepy. My mother's are PG-13, so they're kind of cute. Martha's are very graphic, and this woman, Joan Cuddy, that he had a long-term affair with, on and on, are very graphic too. Olga, having English be her second language, has some force field. She's not as offended by swear words as we Americans are. So she was going to read a small excerpt of the Joan Cuddy. And just quickly, the philosophy to include these, I think, is very important. And we need to give the audience just a flavor of what they're like. So here's Olga.
To Joan Cuddy, July 6th, 1972. Dear, lovely Joan, I read your yellow paper letters like rolling around in a delicious bath. You speak so well of my old ones, you arouse in me a writer's fear that he has slipped. Well, anyway, here goes off the top of my head as usual. You were you and put me back together finally after the shattering thing of Joyce. Not that you were my first after her, you weren't, but you were the first one that seemed as beautiful. That sentence too bold somehow? Forgive it, I mean it. Beauty in your face, the way it opened and closed at the same time when your cunt was entered. Beauty in the wonderful bird and flower expert's way you would examine my prick. beauty in the way your naked body would slither in the guest bed. You were, well, just wonderfully erotic and good-natured. And I have a large scrapbook of indecent and radiant pictures of us I took in my head. And when you shucked it all in, the loss did hurt. But you had to do it, and it would have ended somehow. Affairs are cruel, and if they are seen, they carry the punishment with them. A bind may be traceable to the absurdly urgent natural imperatives to scatter our seed. You were right. Once I began to moon about marriage, and you about having my baby, it was time to pull in and let the social order resume. Mary senses how deeply you got to me, and I don't want to hurt her with us. I also felt her up at Plum Island. But now you are leaving, and I do want to make love with you. I can't justify it. I can't apologize for it either. I want to fuck you, even badly, even sadly, dear Joan. Just typing this, I am getting a hard-on, as this is no kind of letter to be writing to a brainy and earnest college graduate and ecology nut.
Children can enter the room now. So I see we have 10 short minutes to go, Jim. And
Yes.
I can read one very short letter, and then you have sort of one to read at the end, which summarizes things.
Yeah, I think if it's okay with you, Jenny, Michael's got a short one to
That's
read, and I
great.
was just going to read a final letter, and then we're glad to take questions if people have them.
There's just a few questions, so that's fine. Take your time. I'll come off and come back.
Okay, great. Thanks.
This is to a young boy, Christopher O'Donnell. He's a 9-year-old, and he suffers psoriasis. And his father wrote my father asking him to write him. And it goes, "Dear Christopher O'Donnell, I know that psoriasis can be annoying and embarrassing, but there are many more treatments now than when I was 9, and more to come. In 10 years, perhaps, an easy cure will be developed. But for now, submit to what cures there are, include moderate sunshine, and be grateful that it doesn't hurt, and that people with psoriasis are generally pretty healthy otherwise. In Latin, it is called moribus fortiorum, the disease of the strong. Be strong and have a happy holiday. Sincerely yours, John Updike." I failed to mention my father was a lifetime sufferer of psoriasis, and it dictated his life, why they came to Ipswich for the beach and why he went to the Caribbean every year for a week to have the sun burn the psoriasis out of them. And so
I'll move to and thanks, Michael. And also thank you, Olga, for reading the Joan Cuddy letter. I'm just going to end it really with the final months of John Updike's life. In November of 2008, he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, and but he needed to continue to write over the final weeks of his life. And I think in many respects, he needed to write the way a lot of us need to eat and breathe. But in those final weeks, he wrote letters to family, friends, and tried to push forward with 5 book projects that he was working on, 4 of which he completed. And I want to read just a brief excerpt from a letter to him, and then one final letter. Henry Finder, who was the editorial director of The New Yorker, wrote in the final weeks of John Updike's life saying, quote, "I realize that this winter is bound to be an especially dark and difficult time for you, but I hope you know how much admiration, even adoration, you inspire from these Manhattan precincts. Everyone who's had an Updike piece pass through his or her fingers en route to publication feels a bit of a tingle, like touching a magician's silk," which is really a magnificent passage from Henry Finder's letter. But also, I think attests to and speaks to the connection that John Updike had with the New Yorker over more than 50 years, where he published nearly 1,000 pieces. Updike also wrote a postcard to a college friend 2 days before he died, and the postcard was received after his death. But the letter that I wanted to conclude with was the letter of December 15, 2008, to David Remnick, who was the editor at the New Yorker. Dear David, your beautifully generous and warm letter made me begin to cry. First, when my wife read it to me at the hospital over the phone, and now when I can read it holding it in my hand. And I should say that David Remnick had said to John Updike, if there is anything in the world I can do for you, I will. Anything you've not always been a part, and anything you have not always been a part of this thing of ours. You are the thing itself, everything we stand for, everything we hope to be. Every writer, artist, and editor here feels that way. And I know it's no presumption that everyone here is rooting for your speedy, painless, endurable recovery. So back to David Remnick's letter, or John's letter to David Remnick. And so your beautifully generous and warm letter made me begin to cry. First when my wife read it to me at the hospital over the phone, and now when I can read it holding it in my hand. I fell in love with the New Yorker when I was about 11 and never fell out, and never got used to the heavenly sensations of being in print there. I know, of course, that my niche on the canyon walls the magazine has carved through American journalism, literature, and comic art is a mere scratching. But I have taken an inordinate pride in it and huge pleasure in continuing to scratch away during your editorship. As to me, the Cheever review may be my last, but who knows for sure. The journey, as they say, with lung cancer is pretty much one way, but with some loops in it, maybe, and remission under chemo. As with life itself and its broad outlines, there is only submitting to it and trying to be grateful for what, as much in my life does, warrants gratitude. With great respect and affection, John. And as I said, that was one of the final letters, although there were several more that were written and sent in the final weeks of his life. So there's obviously so many more letters that Michael and I could have shared with you, and so much more we'd like to talk about. But Jenny, if it's okay, if there are questions, we'd be glad to take them.
Yep. The other thing I was thinking when you read that last bit, when I was reading it, it felt so different than if you were reading a biography, because it's coming from him. So I knew that he was going to die soon, but it wasn't like a person saying, and then he got sick, and it's like his reaction. I know he was writing, like it was famous that he had been writing the whole time. But even when you wrote that, it's so moving, and it's like a person right before they die, hearing how they felt, not how an author, biographies are great too, but like this was really intense. Having read what his child, the 9-year-old writing to the cartoonists, up to this, it's just like so encompassing. I talked about it constantly as I was reading it, but I remember getting trepidation as I got to the end. It's because I got so into hearing his voice and then thinking, oh, he's going to have to go through this and write about, it was really moving. I just want to say. So we had some questions. Tom Bedell said, I'm reading the letters of E.B. White, the revised edition of which has an introduction by Updike. And there were a few lovely letters in there from White to Updike. Just curious if, I know the answer, but whether there's letters between them, and there is. You mentioned one from Catherine White. But whether there were letters to E.B. White too from Updike.
Yes, there are, and Jim can answer that better.
There are, and there's quite a bit. I mean, as I said, the volume is just a small fraction of the letters that were written, but there would be quite a few letters written, particularly to Catherine White, that you could find at Houghton Library, but also at Bryn Mawr. And then there were also letters to E.B. White back and forth, and but not nearly as many as to Catherine White.
And he writes to her about their visit to London or to England when they visit him, right?
Yeah, that's a wonderful, very funny
Yeah.
when the Whites come and then visit them in Oxford, and then he visits with the Thurbers in London, and this all takes place over roughly a day or so. and he writes a very, very funny and kind of information laden letter of these two visits, to visits with people who were heroes to him. Thurber it certainly was, and E.B. White was as well. And I think E.B. White was the one that he really loved of the four of the two couples that he met. E.B. White was the one who he connected with. And I think they all did. I think Michael's mother Mary did as well, and that as the letter indicates.
Yes.
How did your students, undergrad students, react to reading Updike, Jim? Over the
Well,
years?
it changes over time, and and it's certainly different now than it was 15 or 20 years ago. Because culture has changed, and there's also a sense that students don't read the same things as one another. I was talking to a colleague about this yesterday at lunch, and we said, 30 or 40 years ago, you could go in with a group of graduate students, and there was probably 100 or 200 books that everybody had read that you could talk about. They were canonical novels and so on, and poetry, and that's not the case now. Everybody's reading different things, and so there's a much greater range of literature with the idea that maybe what's canonical is less important to students. I'm not sure. I think it still can be important to their professors who kind of went through an education where that is what mattered. But in answer more specifically, I would say that when I would teach Rabbit is Rich, in particular Rabbit is Rich, which is a novel that I love, but it's a novel that's very polarizing. And I would have in an undergraduate class a third of the students maybe who would come up and say, I love that novel. It's one of the greatest things I've ever read. Another third wanted to throw it out the window. They were really upset and angry. And then maybe the other third wasn't reading as carefully as you would have liked. But there was a range. But I think it's harder. There's certain kinds of things, particularly John Updike does male interiority of the time so well. But male interiority of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s is not necessarily something that a 20-something student is going to be interested in these days in the same way. So I think it's different. I mean, the material still matters to me and a great many readers, but I mean, as is true with all writers from Melville and Faulkner, who are two of the most famous American writers, were out of print at various times, either in their career or just after. So I think literary stature is like a stock market; it goes up and down, and I think right now some of the male interiority doesn't go over quite as well as it would have years ago.
That's interesting. Someone asked do you think there'll be a John Updike postage stamp at some point? Has that ever been in the works?
It's been talked about. The Updike Society, I think, has petitioned it. I think right now, as Jim talked about in today's environment, it might be a little too polarizing to make one for him. Maybe for his 100th, they'll soften up and do it. But I think there's a president of the Updike Society, Jim Plath, who's working hard for all these avenues to promote Updike.
Nice.
So,
and I should just add to what Michael said there, the centennial is coming up in 2032. And I think there's an effort, that's an important year for any writer. And so I think there will be all sorts of things that we'll be aiming to do in 2032 with John Updike. There's also the John Updike Childhood Museum, which opened in Shillington a few years ago. But there was actually a letter that I almost included in the book, but where John was writing to the postmaster of the time, I think in the 1990s, about trying to encourage the postmaster to issue a stamp for the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And it was a very, very clever and persuasive letter, but an effort on his part. But there was not a stamp made of that, at least to this point.
One last question that I didn't get to yet. Any comments he talks about religion a lot. You did address that a little bit, but comment on religion in his work or the letters.
Michael, do you want to talk about, just,
Um,
yeah.
I've kind of said what I can. I mean, I've kind of
Okay, yeah.
I'll punt to you, Jim, on that one.
Okay. Well, with religion, I mean, it's such a, yeah, it's such a part of his writing. I mean, it really, I don't, I think of Roger's version, that novel, where really you have a theology professor and a young computer science graduate student who are debating the existence of God. And you have In the Beauty of the Lilies, where he's talking about how the cinema, the movie theater, has replaced the church as being the dominant locus of yearning and passion and desire in small towns. So I think religion crops up in his fiction all of the time and in his poetry. It was very much. I just finished rereading Terrorist just a couple days ago, and Terrorist is about a young 18-year-old Muslim student in New Jersey who has this incredible faith, and is kind of subjected to all sorts of manipulation by his elders who are trying to get him involved in a terrorist conspiracy. But I think John Updike in that novel was drawn to the faith of this young, and also through this young man's faith, he was able to look at American culture in a way, and seeing the excess and the materialism, the consumerism and the greed, and all of these things. So I think faith uh, is prominent in his writing. And in certain ways, that kind of hurt him with critics in the last decade of his life, because I think, you know, Christian faith, particularly a kind of Protestantism, was seen as being old-fashioned, so to speak, at the time. And so I think that also goes through its periods where it becomes more interesting to readers or less interesting, depending on the time.
Oh, that's fascinating, all of it. I'm going to stop now. I want to ask people to look in the chat. There's information about our next literary cocktail hour and also just other things to sign up for our newsletter. But thank you both. This was incredible. This is amazing. I really appreciate all your insight and your openness and just sharing with us the process for this amazing book. And I really do recommend it to everyone.
Thank you very much for
Thank you.
inviting us.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Michael and Olga. It was good to
Yes.
see you, and thanks for sharing those images of the Steinberg and the Fowler and so on.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right, take
Thanks
care.
everyone
All
for
right,
coming.
Good to see
bye-bye.
you.
Too.
Mhm.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Mhm.
Bye.